Plowshare. In this video I'm going to show you how to make a pillowcase with a contrasting band and trim on it. There's a neat technique to do this so that it all finishes out. You're going to do a French seam along the edge so that the seam is all finished. The materials required is 7/8 of a yard of your main fabric, a 1/4 yard of your band, and 1/8 of a yard of the contrasting trim. Then of course you'll want a cutting mat, ruler, cutter, scissors, thread to match, sewing machine, iron and ironing board. First, I'm going to cut out the main part of the pillowcase. This is going to be 27 by 42 inches. Here's my piece of fabric. The selvages are together. I'm going to fold it in half again so it's folded into quarters. And cut it the 27-inch cut first. So this fold is along the 0 line. My selvages are all together here. Half of 27 is 13.5. So I'll line my ruler up on the mat with the 13.5 inch marks and cut. Now I'm going to line this folded edge with the 0 line and cut it the 42 width, which half of 42 is 21. So I'll line my ruler up with the 21-inch mark on the mat and cut the selvages off. Now that's the main part of my pillowcase. Next I'm going to cut the band. This is going to be 8.5 inches by 42. So first I'm going to line the fold up with the 0 line and cut at 21 again. That will give me my 42 inches. Now slide this down, making sure my fold is straight along that line. Now matching my ruler up to the 8.5 mark. I'll cut the other side. Now the trim, I'm going to cut this 1 3/4 inches by 42. Since this is narrow, I'm just going to use my ruler. First of all, I'm going to straighten this edge. I have the fold along here, and I'm lining the fold up with lines on the ruler so that I know my cut is going to be perpendicular to my fold. And this cut just straightens these edges. Now I'll flip the mat around and with my ruler measure over 1 3/4 inches. Now I'll cut it to the 42 length. I'm going by the 21-inch mark right there. And we're done cutting out. This is the contrasting trim. I'm going to iron this in half. When you're ironing, be careful to keep your strip straight. If you let it curve around like this as you're pressing, it will make it harder for your trim to end up straight. So keep your piece of fabric straight on your ironing board as you press. Now I'm going to mark my stitching line. Now I'm going to mark the stitching line. This is a unique way to do this, but because this trim is very narrow, it's easy for it to, if you don't sew exactly straight, your trim is going to end up being wobbly. So I'm going to mark this 3/8 of an inch from my folded edge. If you can sew perfectly straight, you don't have to do this. For this, I'm using a Choco liner to mark this. Now, take the main pillowcase fabric, open it up, lay this down on the right side with the raw edges even, and pin it on. I recommend putting the pins every 6 to 7 inches. Now I'm going to sew on my marked line. That will just keep the trim basted in place. After you've made several of them and are comfortable, you can omit this step and sewing it in place and go straight to putting this on. But for your first one, we'll do it this way. Now I'm sewing right on that line that I marked. And this is just keeping the trim in place for me for when I sew the band on. Now I'm going to pin the band on. Right sides together, edges even. Pins every 6 to 8 inches. Now I'm going to sew this, but sew it from this side because I have that stitching line that I just sewed as my guide. Now you can see I'm sewing right along that seam that I just sewed, not on top of it, but just slightly to the left. That will ensure that those stitches do not show on the front. It's very important to sew this very straight, or else that little trim will not end up being straight. And rather than watching the needle, it's easier to sew straight if you watch your presser foot and watch the fabric just as it goes under your presser foot. If it's going in straight there, it will still be straight when it goes under the needle. Now I'll go to the ironing board. Now when you have a long seam, it's easy to get a bow in it as you press it. So this is called setting the seam to lay it flat, which is just ironing it flat like this, that sinks the stitches into the fabric, and for a long straight stretch like that, it helps in keeping it straight. Now I'll flip it open and iron it this way. I'm going to take this edge of the pillowcase and loosely roll it up. And then place it here down the middle of that, down the middle of the band. Now I'm going to grab the seam and fold it over to this edge. And I'm going to check and make sure that none of this extra fabric here that's folded up is going to be caught in this as I pin it. I'll start pinning in the middle and work my way across. Make sure that your band does not get twisted. You want the edges to stay even. I'll put a few more pins in to hold it together. Now I'm going to sew again on the same seam line as my guide. Now I'm going to sew this seam, again using my stitches as a guide, my previous stitching line. I'm sewing just to the left of my last stitching line. Sewing a long seam like this, sometimes your top fabric wants to slowly ooch forward. If you let it slowly come forward like that, you'll end up with a twist on your band. So it's very important to not let it gather in front of your next pin. You can use, like I'm using this hand behind, just pulling it very, very slightly to ease that extra fabric in between each pin. Back stitch at the end. And now for the revealing. Now I'm going to pull all of this out. As I'm pulling this out, I'm also turning the inside out, so they both work together at the same time. Pull it all the way out. Unroll that fabric that I rolled all up. And here's the band, finished on the front and finished on the back. Now I'm going to just lightly press this seam open. It falls open easily because I've already pressed it once. And then flip it over to the back, because this is a seam that I just sewed and it has not been pressed. I want to make sure that it gets pressed open very well. And I'll go ahead and press it down and set the crease along the edge. Now I'm going to sew the pillowcase side seam together using a French seam. That will finish the seam out with a very clean, neat seam and no raw edges down on the edge of our pillowcase. Line it up wrong sides together for the first seam. Match this seam and the trim. It's very important that those line up. The folded edges, and then the rest of the side seam. Now I'm going to sew this with a 3/8 inch seam. Starting on the finished edge and back stitching, I'm going to sew up the side seam. When sewing a large piece of fabric, make sure you move all of the fabric that's to the left of your sewing machine as you sew the seam, so that the bulk of your project doesn't get twisted. It'll help you sew a much straighter seam. Now back to the ironing board. I'm going to slide this onto the ironing board and press this seam open. It will just make it much easier when I turn it wrong side out and press the seam again for that seam to already be pressed. So I'm going to pull it off the ironing board, turning it wrong side out as I go. Now I'll press this seam with the seam right at the edge. And I'm going to sew this with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and that will make my French seam. I'm going to pin this with my pin going parallel with the seam, and then open it up to check and make sure that this is all lining up. You don't want to sew it like that and your finished pillowcase ends up not lining up. So always pin it and check. Starting at the finished edge and being careful to neatly backstitch, I'm sewing this with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. There's a lot of thicknesses right here with the trim and that seam, so just take it easy and go slow, and don't stitch on your pin. Now when I get to the end, I'm just going to pivot and sew across the end of the pillowcase. Backstitch. Flip it over and set the machine on zigzag to finish this end. Now before I get to the corner, I'm going to trim this corner off a little bit to eliminate some of the bulk so that my edge will turn out neatly when I turn the pillowcase right side out and poke that corner out. So I'll just turn and zigzag across that I just cut. Now the pillowcase is almost finished. I'm going to turn it right side out and press it and have one other little finishing touch. Turn it right side out. Poke out the corners. And press the seams. Again, I'm making sure to roll the seam all the way to the edge. And the same across the end. The end is on the width grain of the fabric, and so it's always a little harder to press. The grain doesn't want to fold as well as the lengthwise grain. So if you ever wonder why you have to work a little harder to get one side to press than the other, it most likely has to do with the grain of the fabric. Now I'm going to show you how to hand stitch this seam down. I'm going to fold this corner under and then stitch this down just to keep that seam laying nice and flat and not showing it all from the front. Here's my needle. It's threaded, and I'm going to make a quilter's knot. You do that by making an X with your thread and your needle and wrapping the thread about 5 wraps around your needle. I pinch those wraps and slide it down, and there's a perfect knot. Now I'm going to come up on the back side right in the middle of that little crease and tuck that over so my knot is hidden away in there. Just taking small stitches that do not go through on the front side. I'm going to stitch the seam down. Now I'm going to stop here at the edge of the band, take a little stitch and pull it until I have a loop, a small loop. I'm just going to bring my needle through that loop 3 or 4 times and pull it down, and that makes a secure knot at the end. Now instead of just trimming my thread off right here, I can go through the layers and pull it, and that knot will pop inside, and then I can trim it off right here and I have no little loose ends, and that finishes it out. Here's the finished pillowcase. This fits a regular or a queen size pillow. If you would like to make it for a king size pillow, you just add 6 inches to the length of the main piece of fabric, which would make it be 33 inches long instead of 27. So here's the finished pillowcase.